Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. The crack showed up on a Tuesday morning in early March, running across the floor of my kitchen from the base of the south wall to a point just short of the center of the room. I noticed it because I notice flaws. 11 years of laying ceramic tile will do that to you. You develop an eye for grade and level and the way stress distributes itself through a floor system, and you start reading flaws the way other people read faces, picking up on things that most people walk over without registering. The crack was about 4 feet long and a hairline thin, the kind that looks minor until you understand what it's telling you about what's happening underneath. I crouched down and looked at it carefully. The direction was wrong for standard settling. Settlement cracks tend to follow the line of the joists or run corner to corner in a diagonal that reflects the load path. This one ran straight south to north with a slight deviation part way through that suggested something below the slab was moving in a direction that didn't match the building's structure. It looked less like the building settling into the ground and more like something in the ground moving against the building. I mentioned it to my building manager, a methodical man named Groff, who handled the property with the quiet competence of someone who had been doing it for 20 years and had seen most things. He came and looked at it, agreed it was worth attention, and said he'd have the foundation checked when he could get someone in. He said it with the tone of someone adding an item to a list that already had other items on it. I let it sit for a week. Then I went down to the basement myself. My building was a 4-story walk-up built in the early 60s, the kind of construction that was solid, if not elegant. Poured concrete foundation with a basement level that ran the full footprint of the building and was used for storage and mechanicals. I had a storage unit down there, a wire cage about 6 feet square, where I kept excess tile stock and tools I didn't need regularly. I'd been in the basement dozens of times over the 3 years I'd lived in the building, and I knew its layout without thinking about it. The door at the far end of the mechanical room was not something I'd thought about before. It was a heavy metal door, industrial, set into the south wall behind the building's boiler. I'd assumed it was a utility access, another mechanical space, or perhaps an old coal storage room from the building's original configuration. The lock on it was a standard padlock, the same brand Groff used on the storage cages, which meant Groff had a key to it and had presumably been through it at some point. It was unlocked when I tried it. The door opened into a concrete staircase going down, maybe 15 steps, ending at a passage that ran south. The passage was about 6 feet wide and just over 6 feet tall, concrete walls and ceiling, a smooth, poured floor. There was lighting, which was the thing that stopped me at the bottom of the stairs. A strip of low LED lighting running along the base of each wall, continuous, clean, running as far down the passage as I could see. The LEDs were not installed by any contractor I recognized. They were recessed into a channel that had been cut into the concrete with a precision that suggested specialized equipment and a practiced hand. The work was recent. The concrete around the channel was clean and unweathered. I went back upstairs and looked up whether my building had any documented sub-basement level on the city's public records database. It didn't. I went back the following evening with a better flashlight and the specific mindset of a person who has decided they need to understand something before they can decide what to do about it. The passage ran south for about 100 feet before intersecting a larger space. The larger space was a junction, roughly circular, maybe 30 feet across, with 4 passages branching off from it in different directions. The ceiling here was higher, maybe 10 feet, and the lighting was better. The same LED strips, but supplemented by overhead fixtures at regular intervals. The floor of the junction was cleaner than the passage I'd come from. Cleaner in the way high-traffic areas get worn smooth and then scrubbed regularly. There were marks on the floor at the junction, scuffed into the concrete by the passage of feet over a long period of time. They radiated outward from the center toward each of the 4 branch passages with the natural distribution of a space that many people move through regularly, spreading out in the directions of their various destinations. I stood in the junction and looked at the 4 passages and thought about the fact that I was standing in an active transit space of some kind, directly below my apartment building, and that neither the city records nor my building manager appeared to know it was there. I took the passage that ran back in the direction I'd come from, the one that connected to my building's basement, and I went home and I thought about the crack in my kitchen floor and what was causing it for a long time before I fell asleep. Here is what I worked out over the following days, piecing it together from what I'd seen and what I knew about foundation mechanics. The junction and its branch passages were being used regularly. The foot traffic was consistent enough to have worn the floor and established clear paths. Consistent foot traffic in a tunnel produces vibration, and vibration transmits through concrete, and over time that transmission does things to whatever sits above it. The crack in my kitchen floor was running south to north because the passage below it ran south to north, and the stress was traveling directly upward along that line. I didn't know who was using the tunnels or where the other passages led. What I knew was that the use was ongoing and that my building's foundation was absorbing the effects of it, and that the crack I'd found was not going to be the last one. I went back to the junction a 3rd time and I waited. Her name was Vey. I know that because she told me eventually, after we'd spent about 10 minutes in the junction doing the careful mutual assessment of 2 people who have encountered each other somewhere neither of them fully expected to be. She was maybe 35, compact, wearing clothes that were practical and well-made, but in a style I didn't recognize. The kind of workwear that suggested function over fashion, but designed by someone with different conventions than the ones I was used to. She was carrying a light source of her own, a small handheld device that threw a steady white light and that I didn't recognize as any brand I knew. She had the particular stillness of someone who had been startled but was experienced enough at being startled that the recovery happened fast. She looked at me with the expression of someone whose calculation had just come back with an unexpected result. I asked her how long she'd been using the tunnels. She said, in slightly careful English, about 8 months. I asked her where the tunnels went. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said the question was more complicated than it sounded, and asked if I wanted the complicated answer or the simple one. I told her I'd take whatever was accurate. The world she came from had experienced a surface event about 60 years ago that had made the upper levels of cities uninhabitable for roughly a generation. The specifics of the event she described without detail, and I didn't push because the specifics weren't the relevant part. What was relevant was what the cities had done in response, which was to build down. The underground infrastructure that had started as emergency shelter had become, over decades, a full parallel city. Transit systems, residential levels, commerce, all of it developed below the surface with the accumulated refinement of 60 years of people living underground and working out what that required. The surface had been reclaimed gradually. Her city now existed on both levels, above ground and below, with the below-ground portions remaining the primary transit and infrastructure layer. The tunnel I'd found was part of that transit network. In her world, this section of the city had been built downward through geological layers that, in her world, contained no existing structures. She didn't know a building existed above the junction until she found the bleed point. She'd been the one to discover the crossing, about a year ago, exploring a section of tunnel that the transit maps showed as disused. She'd come through once, understood roughly what she was looking at, and gone back. Then she'd come back. I asked her why. She said because the surface of a city that had never needed to build underground was something she'd never seen before, and she was, by nature and by profession, someone who needed to understand how things were built. She was an infrastructure engineer. She said, standing in my neighborhood and looking at buildings that had never been built to accommodate an underground city below them was the most interesting thing she'd encountered in years. I told her that her interesting observation was cracking my kitchen floor. She went still. Then she said, I know. She'd been aware of the foundation problem for about 3 months. She'd identified it through the tunnel system's own monitoring, which tracked load and stress through the transit network as a matter of standard infrastructure management. The anomalous readings above the junction had showed up in the data, and she'd been the one to investigate them because she was the one who knew what was causing them. She'd been trying to work out a solution without revealing herself, which she acknowledged had not been going well. The problem was that the solution required action on her side of the crossing, a reroute of the transit line that ran through the junction below my building, and that kind of reroute required authorization from people she'd have to explain the situation to. She'd been trying to find a way around that requirement and had not found one. I asked her what a reroute involved. She told me. The tunnel branch that ran directly beneath my building's foundation was one of 4 routes through the junction. Removing it from active transit use would redirect the load to the other 3, which were routed through geological sections that didn't have the same surface overlap problem. The vibration source would move away from my building's foundation. The cracking would stop. I asked how long a reroute would take once authorized. She said 2 weeks, maybe 3. She said getting authorization meant telling her supervisors about the crossing, which she'd been avoiding, which was going to be a conversation she wasn't looking forward to. I asked her what happened to the bleed point if the tunnel was closed. She said it would close with it. The crossing existed because of the active transit use, keeping the boundary thin. Without the transit, the boundary would thicken, and eventually the passage between the two would seal. I asked her if that bothered her. She was quiet for a moment. looking at one of the junction passages in the way that people look at things they're already starting to miss. She said it was the right solution. She said that answer and the answer to whether it bothered her were not the same answer, but that the first one was the relevant one. I told her I understood. The reroute took 18 days. I know because I checked the crack in my kitchen floor every morning. For the first week, it stayed the same. Then it stopped being what it had been and started being something older. The active stress relieved. The crack settling into the kind of dormant state that old cracks take on when whatever was driving them is no longer driving them. By the end of the third week, it was just a crack, historical rather than current, the record of something that had happened rather than something that was happening. Groff came by to look at it eventually and said it appeared to have stabilized, which it had, and that he'd have someone do a cosmetic patch, which they did. The patched line across my kitchen floor is barely visible now. You'd have to know where to look. I went down to the basement twice during those 18 days. The first time the passage was still there, and the lighting was still running, and the junction still had the quality of an active space. The second time, on the 16th day, the lighting was off. I went as far as the junction with my flashlight, and the overhead fixtures were dark, and the floor had the particular stillness of a space that was no longer being used. The scuff marks were still there, worn into the concrete by years of foot traffic, but the traffic itself had stopped. I went back on the 18th day, and the door at the bottom of the stairs was sealed. Not locked, not blocked. Sealed. The gap between the door and the frame filled with something that had cured solid. The door now flush with the wall in a way that suggested it had always been flush with the wall. I pressed my hand against it. It didn't move. I went back upstairs. Groff asked me a few weeks later if I knew anything about the door in the mechanical room, whether I'd tried it recently, because he'd gone to check it and found it sealed and didn't know when that had happened. I told him I'd noticed it looked that way and that I'd assumed it was an old utility access that had been decommissioned at some point. He accepted that, made a note to have it looked at when he had time, and moved on to the other items on his list. The other items on his list were longer than the item about the door, and I suspected the door would stay on the list without moving to the top of it for a while, maybe indefinitely. That seemed fine. I think about Vey occasionally. I think about what it would take to spend months studying a world from its margins, learning the texture of it through careful observation, building an understanding of it from the outside in. I think about the specific quality of curiosity required to keep going back to something you're not supposed to be doing, motivated by the simple need to understand how something was built. I recognize that quality. It's the same thing that makes me stop and look at a floor when something about it isn't right. The same thing that took me to the basement when Groff's timeline didn't suit me. The same thing that put me in the junction on 3 separate evenings waiting for something I couldn't have predicted but needed to see. She was an infrastructure engineer, and so, in a different way, am I. We both spent our working lives understanding the hidden systems that hold things up. I think that mattered. I think it was why the conversation in the junction worked. I don't know what it cost her to authorize the reroute, what the conversation with her supervisors involved, what version of the crossing she told them about. I hope it was less complicated than she'd expected. I have no way of knowing. Some evenings, I'm in the kitchen and I look at the patched crack in the floor and I think about what's below me. Not the building's basement, not the sealed door in the mechanical room. Below all of that, the geological layer where a transit junction sits in a world that built downwards because it had to, where 4 passages branch off in 4 directions through an underground city I'll never see, where the passage that used to run north no longer runs because someone I spent 40 minutes talking to in the middle of the night made a phone call she didn't want to make. I press my hand flat against the kitchen floor sometimes just to feel what's there, which is tile and concrete and the ordinary solidity of a building sitting on its foundation the way it's supposed to sit. No vibration, no transmission from below, just the silence of a structure that doesn't know what used to run beneath it. I know. That's enough.